So our next speaker is Angelyn Rowan, again speaking on the topic of lean construction. So Angela is a partner in Philip Lee's Solicitors construction projects and PPP team, having joined Philip Lee from another leading Irish firm last year. Angelyn has extensive experience advising on major infrastructure projects and complex procurement matters. She's advised on some of the most significant projects in Ireland in recent years, including the National Development Finance Agency on the Social Housing PPP programme, Third Level Institutes PPP, which we're getting a building at GMIT, Grange Gorman DIT Campus PPP, and the primary care centres. In the area of construction, Angelyn advises funders, developers, employers and contractors on all aspects of construction law, specialising principally in non-contentious areas such as commercial, office, residential, healthcare and energy projects. She advises on many of the standard forms of contract, including the public works contracts, architects contract, engineers contract, FIDIC, MF1 and new engineering contracts, as well as drafting bespoke contracts. So today, one of the things various people that have been involved in LCI have been discussing over recent years is where lean fits in the contractual process of construction. So Angelyn's going to consider the barriers and drivers for lean construction in the procurement process. Thank you.
Thanks very much there, Martin, for the introduction. My name is Angelyn Rowan. As Martin said, I'm a construction lawyer, work in Philip Lee Solicitors in construction, procurement and PPP. The other hat I wear, and it's the principal reason I'm here today, and I hope you can hear me okay, is that I am on the board of Lean Construction Ireland. Recent years I've become very familiar with lean construction, and delighted to be here today to talk about that and the contractual process involved. We do have a subgroup within LCI that focuses on contracts, and as Richard outlined, that's one of our key objectives, is to look at the contractual process. It is I suppose, a journey we're on, and it's a journey, and I think we're only at the beginning of it in terms of the contractual process. So I suppose today I've been asked to talk about the drivers and barriers to lean construction in that procurement process. And I suppose for those of you in the room that are students, I hope that when this conversation has been had again in 10, 20 years' time, that some of these concepts you'll see in practice, because changes in contracts, incorporating them does take time. People want to see examples that have worked in practice. They don't want to be the first to do anything different. So I do hope that for those of you in the room, this will give you some food for thought and changes you might see coming into the industry in the coming decades. So firstly, what do we mean? I'm doing this properly. The keyboard. No, it's not connected. Yeah. So I suppose, what do we mean by lean? Because as Richard said, people say, well, certainly lawyers go, well, what does that mean? When it comes to construction, it can be broadly defined as the practices used to maximise value, reduce waste, and key to this is it's through collaborative communication and planning. It's largely a process that to improve the flow, you're analysing a process, continually identifying opportunities to reduce waste and maximise efficiency. Its origins are frequently accredited to the Toyota manufacturing process, just-in-time lean, and that's very much where it comes from. And in the construction industry, it involves looking at the procurement process and also, is it up and running? You're working with me, okay. And the planning of a project before it even starts. So obviously key to that is the procurement process, but also prior to mobilisation, teams working together. Okay, well, I'll just keep going anyway. So the consideration, when we talk about a procurement process, what are we talking about? It means looking at the various stages of a procurement process. Principally, you'll have your tender stage, and then you'll have the contract that's ultimately entered into between the parties. So I'm going to look at both of those. So the tender process, the pre-qualification, the RFT, request for tenders, and also then consider the contract form that's ultimately entered into between the parties. So I'm going to look first at the drivers. Yes, that's the one I'm on, the one with the 20. The drivers. And I think that's a very positive place to start as opposed to the barriers. It was mentioned earlier by John, the Project 2040. So there's significant increase in the level of activity in the construction industry in Ireland in the past number of years. I was working in law and construction in those years of 2008 to 2012, and I can tell you it was pretty dismal. But things have significantly picked up since then. So in the coming years and presently, there's a huge amount of investment in infrastructure and construction projects. So that's clearly a big driver. The National Development Plan, which was mentioned this morning, it's part of Project 2040. There's 116 billion planned in infrastructure spend by the government over the next 10 years. Great, thank you. It's expected that the public capital investment will reach 4% of national income this year, which is well above the European average of 2%. The population growth up to 2040 is 1.3 million extra people living in this country, and it's estimated that 500,000 new homes will be required up to that time, up to 2040. So the increased activity poses considerable challenges both for the industry and the clients that are requiring these projects to be built. In a recent government publication called the Prospects Report, it was published in December 2019, it was recognised that there's actually a lot of constraints facing the construction industry. And Minister Donoghue, in the foreword to that, stated, Ireland needs a competitive, dynamic and sustainable construction firms that can deliver high-quality physical infrastructure to all our citizens. He says, our prosperity depends on it, and the government and industry must work together to make that a reality. So the upshot of that, and what's coming out, certainly on the public sector, is a recognition that we need to do things differently. There's a need for a change of approach. And clearly one driver to change that approach is the procurement processes that are used and the manner in which the public sector procure construction projects. In March 2019, the government launched a review of the procurement policy for major public works, and that involves looking at the capital works management framework. So that's the public, for those who don't know, that's the whole framework, contractual policy around what contracts are used for major infrastructure projects in the public sector and the use of the public works contracts. So they are undergoing review at the moment. It started in March 2019, supposed to take in around 18 months. So this is a unique opportunity for the government to see how change can be brought about. And again, a driver to look at lean and how it can improve the processes and develop that sustainable, dynamic construction industry that the government recognise is needed. Richard mentioned the McKinsey report underlying the productivity imperative, and I think that report is clearly underlying that something needs to change. I mentioned about the government recognising that we actually do need a modern, innovative and resilient construction sector. The recession, there were construction firms going out of business weekly, and there needs to be a sustainable industry into the future that can build out this infrastructure. There was also mention earlier about the imperative of climate change, and you need a construction industry that is sustainable so it can actually meet those challenges of climate change, embracing innovation, new technological developments. So without that sustainable industry, they can't invest in resources in order to meet those challenges. So the imperative is a clear driver to look at lean and how it can improve productivity and create a more sustainable construction industry. I mentioned there in the slide around the Egan report. That's a UK task force that were asked to look at the construction industry. It's back as far as 1998. And they recognised that there was significant change required in the construction industry. They've been doing the same thing the same way for too long. Other industries have moved on. And the urge in that report, which I think is still applicable today, is to look at the whole process and what changes can be brought about. I think there's a rather stark comment in the slide there where it said the industry had two choices. They either ignore all the evidence of why they need to change, and or believe that they're so unique that they don't need to look at the lessons learned. So it's really a challenge to the industry, and I think that challenge is still there. So it recognised in that report that there needed to be radical changes in the processes, and it actually says in the report, sustained improvement should be delivered through the use of techniques for eliminating waste and increasing value for the customer. And these are core to the lean philosophy. So another driver of change is how we actually, how we contract. In the US, there's been significant development around thinking around lean construction process and techniques, which extends to looking at the actual contract forms that are used. In 2004, the Lean Construction Institute in the US, and there are streets ahead of us insofar as I can gather when it comes to lean, they looked at the relationship between the types of contract used and lean construction. And we talk about it in law traditional contracting, which is a more adversarial approach, which is quite typical, and something called relational contracting, which is much more of a cooperative, collaborative type of model. And in there was a paper published subsequent to this symposium that was held in 2004 by the Lean Construction Institute. And there's leading persons in this field. Glenn Ballard, who actually spoke at one of our events last year, was one of the authors of this report. And they said that the contract form alone will not be sufficient. You do need a change of behaviours and culture. Nonetheless, they said that the actual contract form can facilitate the pursuit of lean ideals. And I've put up on the slide there some points around what we call traditional contracts. There was a report done by PwC Australia, which I think is just a really excellent read. It was published in 2018, you can get it online, about collaborative contracting. And they highlighted 4 things that are not working when it comes to traditional contracting. And I just summarised 4 of them there on the slide. The risk allocation, so when we come to typical traditional contracting, you have your risks, you give them to one party or the other. But the issue with that is when it comes to solving complex issues that might arise during a construction project, because they're inherently risky, they're over duration of time, something always arises. But are the parties actually incentivised to work together to solve these problems? And invariably, the traditional contract, they're not. It's a blame game. Who did what? I didn't do it. They did it. The designer's at fault. No, the contractor's at fault. So it's again, does that serve the purposes of a modern society and also a complex contracting? The other item they mentioned was fixed prices do not incentivise or motivate. So, in fact, if a contractor is on a fixed price contract, there's a question around, in fact, the way they make the most money and profit is to minimise the costs. They gave the example of, ground conditions risk. If there's an issue there, it's back to the contract. Have they priced it in? And unfortunately, the evidence is that in certain contracts, you just end up in dispute, and there's time and money involved in resolving these issues, rather than a contract that might incentivise the parties to minimise costs, come up with technical solutions, and then work them out together. There's no incentive to contain the cost impact of variations. And finally, the last point was around, obligations to cooperate in contracts. They are difficult to enforce, which is a fair point. So really, the key issue in a traditional contract is very much you have your client and owner, and their objectives are different to the objectives of the contractor and design team. So there's a misalignment there. And I suppose when it comes to what are called relational contracts, which are more collaborative in nature, suddenly everyone's interests are more aligned, and we can get into a little bit more detail about how that's done. Some of it is around, how one is rewarded financially, target pricing, what's called pain gain share. So if the cost goes up, everyone takes a little bit of a hit, and certainly that incentivizes people to work together to reduce that impact. So when it comes to the barriers, I suppose I put a few points up there on the slide around, like, in day-to-day, I'm advising on contracts and major projects, and it's kind of like where to start. Do you start with pre-qualification docs? Are we talking about the technical processes? We have our public works contracts, and we're obliged to use those. There's a certain lack of examples out there, but there are more and more coming to the fore. There's certain sectors where it is very prevalent that they're using more collaborative contracting. Certainly from my experience of LCI, it's the pharma industry and the tech industry. They are way more advanced than other sectors in the use of the form of contract. And in fact, people I've encountered in LCI that have worked on projects using what's IPD, which is integrated project delivery type contracts, which are very rare, but they have worked on them. They said they never want to work on a traditional contract again. The job satisfaction and getting a job done, it's completely different. But it does need a change of culture. Contract is one thing, words on a page. Behaviours need to change as well. In terms of the forms of contract, there isn't a lot of experience in this jurisdiction about using more collaborative forms of contracts. Even things like NEC, they're only becoming more used here, and they'd be seen as much more kind of collaborative in nature. But there are, I'll come on to it later, there are promising developments in that area. And then again, how do we measure lean? It's a difficult thing to assess in a tender process. And I've come on to that on the next slide. So it's meaningfully measure that. You've got 10 contractors coming, you ask them to say how they're going to be lean in their construction. How do you measure that? There's a good example I've mentioned there about a US case study. It was written about in the US Lean Construction Journal. There was a building, it's a university building in the US. It was an older building built in 1937, and they did a significant renovation and modernization project, 41 million US dollars. And they wanted to use the IPD model. So that's the contract, that's very collaborative, great. But how are they actually going to assess and measure those participants who were tendering for this project to make sure they were actually going to live the contract? So what they did is they shortlisted down from 10 down to 3, and as part of the tender process, they allowed for a 2-hour workshop for the tenderers to come in. And they invited them to come in. They said, you come in and we're kind of giving you free rein, and your purpose, the purpose of the workshop was to work with the client team to gain a more intimate knowledge of the project and the overall goals and requirements of the client. So that's what they were asked to do. They were told that the things that would be looked at would be leadership potential, team chemistry, collaborative nature of each team. Now, when you say to a client, and I advise people on procurement documents, they're very difficult things to measure. Team chemistry. How can one be fair and transparent in a tender process? But this example, I think, is a genuine example of how objectively they sought to assess these bidders and ultimately award them points, and whoever performed the best got the more points and obviously won the competition. So they were given full autonomy as regards how many people they'd bring, room setup, what media tools they'd use. And it was interesting. The first team that came in had the room set up with 4 different tables. They had 4 different kind of leaders at each table, and then they had a facilitator in the room. And what the evaluation team found was that team, the way they'd set up and structured the room and elicited information, the clients actually spoke the most and gave the most information back, which was in turn would feed into the design and then would lead to a more collaborative project. Another team, it was just one big boardroom table, and the setup was, they just didn't quite get the conversation going with the client. And then there was another one was kind of a halfway between the two. But they recorded all the outcomes, they had a very objective way of documenting it, and ultimately points were awarded. So it is possible to design a procurement process to try and assess that very, what could be a subjective thing about team chemistry. But they did it, and it was well documented, and I think it's a very good example of how you can integrate the assessment of lean into a procurement process. So another barrier which I mentioned earlier was the form of contract. So I don't know if any of you have done even basic courses in law, but in Ireland we work on the common law system, and that assumes for all contracts that it's an adversarial approach. So it's two parties come to a contract. In a commercial setting, they're supposed to have freedom to contract, and that leads to the risk allocation, and very much it's yours or it's mine. So it's been argued, as I said earlier, that this isn't necessarily suitable for complex construction projects, and because of the inherent uncertainties that are all very much apparent in construction projects. And typically, the negotiation of a contract, it isn't always the case that both parties have an equal bargaining position. And invariably in public sector projects, the contract's just put out there and it's pretty much non-negotiable. So the adversarial system doesn't necessarily work. So the benefits there are clear benefits to a more collaborative contract approach. But when we thought about barriers, I have clients who say, well, that contract, this risk sharing and, target pricing, that sounds a bit woolly, and I want to be very clear on where my rights are and my obligations are. And that can lead to people being very concerned about going down a different route when it comes to a contract. And I think we're still very much on that journey. But the evidence is there that the outcomes for a project where you use a more collaborative contract are measured and can be measured and do lead to good results. There's the most, I suppose, extreme version of a collaborative contract would be IPD or alliancing. And, some people have, well, if there's a cost overrun, will that ultimately all fall to the client? That's not necessarily how they're designed. In fact, what most IPD alliancing contracts allow for is that there's a pool of profits. So in an IPD, the most purest sense, you have your contractor, design team and client all in one contract, and then their profits are put in a pool. And if the project goes over in terms of costs, that pool is accessed, that pool of money. So everybody's profits are reduced. So you can imagine if an issue arose in terms of a design deficiency or a ground condition risk, suddenly everybody's incentivized to work together, the designers, the contractors and the client, to come up with a solution, as opposed to, no, I'm actually not responsible for that, that's the designer's issue. Another example is in an NEC4 contract, they've got an early warning system, and the contractor is supposed to, as early as possible, bring issues to the client's and the team's attention so that they can work together to resolve it. And if they don't, and there is compensation due for what could potentially be a variation, that compensation will be reduced if they haven't used the early warning system. So there is bite to these contracts, and they're not necessarily soft. There is an issue around, in common law jurisdictions like the UK and Ireland, around the enforceability of good faith type wording in contracts. So collaborative contracts would invariably have, they talk about mutual trust and cooperation, good faith clauses. And to date, certainly in good faith clauses, there's been a hesitancy in the court system to actually enforce those good faith obligations. So that is a real challenge and continues to be a challenge. In terms of, I mentioned a case there on the slide, that's a UK case, Bates versus the Post Office. It's a very recent case in 2019. It was the first time in the UK where the court actually supported a good faith obligation. And they said, if you have what's called a relational contract as opposed to a more traditional one, and they gave the attributes of that, the features of that, then the court will enforce a good faith obligation. And in the legal world, that's actually a big step forward. It's yet to be followed in Ireland, but it depends if a case comes to court. But I think frequently what happens in UK judiciary can be persuasive in this jurisdiction. So I think that's a move in the right direction. So the final point there in the slide is just ascertaining the preferred model and contract form. And it is something in LCI that we are looking at in terms of feeding out information about the possibilities that are out there in terms of what contracts to choose. So on a more positive note, the promising developments. I mentioned about the review of the Capital Works Management Framework. In the interim review of the public works contracts in 2014, which is mentioned, there's a quote there on the slide, there is wording in the public works contract around, cooperation, but really, when they're being lived, the evidence is that that isn't the case, and the opposite often arises with the client and the contractor, ending up in arbitrations or adjudications. And it was very encouraging to see the comment that during this period of engagement and looking at these contracts, the government are looking at ways in which the cooperation measures can be better integrated into contracts and parties incentivised to ensure a better outcome for the project. And that's all about what we call collaborative contracting and lean, and hopefully we will see more evidence of that coming in the next turns of these documents. There's several public bodies who, leading the way in terms of the contract forms. They're looking at using, they are intending to use NEC4. There's some airport projects and some significant road and rail projects where they already have and are planning to use NEC4. NEC4 is a UK form of contract, and it's much more of a collaborative in nature. It isn't the full alliancing IPD, but it's a step in the right direction. There's also, in the UK in 2016, they published a thing called the Framework Alliancing Contract, and I've seen David Mosey, he's in King's College London, speak on that contract, and it genuinely does seem to be gaining traction in the UK. My understanding is that is like an umbrella agreement that sits over other agreements, which I think would be very palatable as a first step for the public sector in this jurisdiction. And I know there's some third level institutions looking at using that on their projects in Ireland. As recently as I think late last year, the Crown Commercial Services, which are like the OGP in the UK, have adopted a 30 billion contractor alliance based on using that framework contract. So I think that's a real runner, and it's been used in other jurisdictions such as Italy as one example. So lean construction processes as well can still be used without changing the contract form. So there's very much the opportunity through the specification and through the RFT asking bidders to actually say how they will incorporate lean into their projects, and then putting that in the actual contract so that there is KPIs relating to how they use lean in their thinking, in their practices, and in their construction techniques. And I don't think there's anything to stop anybody seeking to incorporate that in any contract. Richard mentioned some of the things that Lean Construction Ireland are doing in this area to support the incorporation of lean techniques and thinking into the contractual process. We have our annual book of cases, which from a lawyer's point of view, I find really useful to read because it really gives you a grasp of what it means. And many of those projects, they don't necessarily work under a collaborative contract, but they are incorporating lean nonetheless with very positive results for the contractor, the supply chain, and the client. The annual conference we have later on in the year I think is very inspirational, and there's a lot of examples and ideas which I think are really encouraging. And then we have regional events as well, and webinars I know were mentioned. In the contracts group in LCI, we carried out a survey on the most commonly used contracts in Ireland, in addition to some others that are more used less frequently. And they're mentioned there in the blue colours at the end. So we asked the people that were surveyed to kind of award marks towards different aspects of these contracts. So we asked, which were the ones they thought were more adversarial, which were more collaborative, which had more the ability to support lean requirements. And the result is there on the slide. The public works contracts were deemed or perceived to be the least collaborative, right up to IPD. JCT, RAI are quite low, which are very commonly used, obviously. Well, the RAI, obviously, in Ireland. FIDIC is kind of in the middle. The FAC is the one I've mentioned earlier. NEC4, very much moving towards the more collaborative end. And I said we are seeing examples of public bodies seeking to use that in Ireland. The contracts group in LCI are looking at ways, and indeed we've been asked by one public sector body to suggest wording that they'd incorporate into their tender process to include lean requirements, and we're going to make a few suggestions in that regard. The client forum, which Richard mentioned, I think is crucial, because unless the clients ask for this in their contract documents, the industry, I don't think, will invest and move on. Well, it certainly will help if the client asks for it. I think there are certain contractors who do see the benefits nonetheless. And we're actively engaging with the industry and government, and we're hoping to engage more with those that are looking at the public works contracts to see what can be done. So I've kind of summarised it by saying I think the change will be incremental, but I do believe there is going to be change. And as I said at the outset, I hope people in this room in the decades to come do see a significant change in the processes and in the contract forms. It will take leadership and courage. It's hard, it's very easy to stay in the old ways and stick with the contract you did the last time and keep it the same. So the challenge is there for those who are driving these matters forward. And I suppose the question is, are we ready for that challenge? So thank you very much. If you have any questions.